Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah. So, I'm going to make a few more comments about the incident. Sounds like, isn't that what they always said in the Avengers movies, right? The incident. I want to take a few moments to comment because some people seem to be a little bit dismayed at my apparent lack of Islamic decorum or adab. And I want to address this a little bit because I find it to be a bit insincere. And what I mean by that is there are certain figures in our community, like Daniel Haqiqaju, that have made a cottage industry and a living out of attacking and slandering people. And this is something that has been going on for years now, and yet this person has somehow still managed to not only attract a certain kind of audience, of course it helps when you pay for your followers, but there's no doubt there will be a certain kind of individual, particularly a young, foolish person, that will be attracted to what to what he has to say and how he speaks and talks. No doubt that there will be an audience for that. But I also have found that by and large, those in the leadership community abroad have not really condemned that kind of behavior very much. And so what I have found is that not only are there people in general that, oh my goodness, there's an imam that used a term, an abbreviation for a term. Oh my God, this is unimaginable. No imam could possibly do this. One, if I were a person that just in my casual speech spoke like that, I think there would probably be more legitimate grounds for that. But what I find is that this is a very selective form of outrage that is not, in my opinion, untethered to the fact that those words were uttered not only from an imam, but from a convert imam. And so what I have seen in general is that most of the supposed outrage mainly came from the non-convert community. There were some converts that were like, brother, that's not really appropriate. And I'm not going to say that, I'm not going to try to deny any of that. What it is, it's more the intensity of the outrage, that we have people that are more outraged over the use of one three-letter word and one two-letter abbreviation than they are about not only this issue with Daniel, but actually many other things. And that I feel that if it had come from an imam that was from a born Muslim background, more particularly born Muslim meaning from abroad, that it would have probably been excused or overlooked, or it wouldn't have been this ghastly shock. And this is partly due to, in the previous video that I just made, the performative aspect of Islam, and in particular of the performative aspect of being imam, and perhaps even more so the performative aspect of also being a convert. And within the issue of a performative Islam, with you, if you will, is also the desire for control. And I think that there is no type of Muslim that is more susceptible to the machinations of control than that is the convert. And part of this is due to the fact that many born Muslims idealize converts, that somehow we are better than those who were born Muslim because supposedly we chose Islam. This is such an absolute, nonsense. And so out of that misplaced idolization of conversion to Islam also becomes not only an expectation of a 10 out of 10 flawless performance, but that it's like you kind of become a sort of porcelain doll that you have to be very smooth and have no rough edges. And that also, I would also say that it undoubtedly has some connection to the idea, or some connection to some issues that are rooted in racial prejudice. I think I'm well known to be a person that doesn't casually invoke racism and white supremacy, partly because, one, these are such overused terms, both in their invocation and in their application. But what I mean by that is some of the response that people said, oh man, look at this ghetto imam. And this wasn't from fellow black folks, right? Because if it had been some other black folks, man, like, man, this brother, you know, he's still a little bit hood. You know, that would have been an internal observation that we all would have understood the cues, and we may have laughed at, or in many ways it wouldn't even have been need to have been uttered. But from the fact that this was an observation that came from predominantly non-black or foreign black, yes, I'm looking at you, the Somali community. If it had come from them, I mean, the fact that it came from predominantly those communities showed that, again, part of the very unspoken and subconscious expectation of performative Islam as it relates to converts, and doubly so to convert imams, is this genteel white nature. And what's funny is, if like you don't have white people that can get super ratchet, I think this also speaks to the sort of racial stereotype that many when I say foreign Muslims, I mean folks that are born here, but perhaps their parents or grandparents came from abroad, and they have grown up in a bubble kind of that's still very much influenced by their culture from abroad, to speak nothing of those who are actually from that culture from abroad. And so many of them imagine that, well, the only reason why he said what he said, oh, is because he's hood, because he's black, or I guess because he's so light-skinned, we actually thought maybe he wasn't black, but now that his behavior has manifested in this way, now his real blackness has come out. And so this is why I'm saying I really feel it is really rooted in a very subtle form of racism, as if there was no other explanation of why I was so angry. In fact, the reason why I said what I said was out of a moment of real intense anger, because I am privy to information that perhaps some of you are not, as it relates to some of the consequences of Daniel's vitriol and his harassing and the type of violence that it has incited against certain people, and the consequences thereof. And so when I saw this again, and yes, it was personal to me, because one, in this instance, Imam Suhaib is a very close friend of mine. He's a very beloved friend of mine, and so part of my reaction was as a man and as a friend. Did that meet some perfect flower under a glass, 10 out of 10 porcelain doll Islamic performance of adab? No, because I'm a man. As the Prophet ﷺ, he said, yeah, la taqada, but he also said, wala ana bashar mithlukum. You know, don't get angry, but also I'm a man like the rest of you. And there were instances where the Prophet ﷺ did actually get angry. And so this also has to do, I think, with a very, very poorly misunderstood aspect of what it means to be a righteous person, right? That to be a salih, right, doesn't mean that you get 10 out of 10 on your adab score. It doesn't mean that you don't ever get angry. It doesn't mean that you don't perhaps slip here or there. And I think to hold anybody to that, I don't care whether you're an imam or not an imam, is actually quite counterproductive to people's Islam in the long run. You know, additionally, I really feel that we need to have another discussion on what does it mean to be an imam. Now, of course, the Quran mentions Sayyidina Ibrahim, Prophet Abraham, alayhi salam, may Allah bless him and his family, as being imam. But then there is also people in our history, right, post-revelation history, that are imam. And these are undoubtedly righteous people. But then when you read their biographies, they are not, 10 out of 10 flawless, ma'asum, infallible people. And yet increasingly, the Muslims today will not tolerate any rough edges, as it were, in not just the character of their imams, but just in their personalities. Of course, we don't want people that are going to use coarse language all the time, which obviously I do not do. And that goes for, whether that's in my public persona or private, but in neither do I just have a habit of wanting to just, drop certain kinds of language. But yes, when I get angry, I have a very human reaction. And you read the biography of the Prophet's companions, alayhi salatu salam, may Allah be pleased with all of them. You will see that sometimes they were very rough in their character. I mean, Umar ibn al-Khattab, one of the greatest Muslims that ever was a dear companion of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and was one of the first leaders of the Muslim community after his demise, was known for being a little rough around the edges, and that when he merely heard somebody reciting the Quran in a way that he thought personally was wrong, he snatched the person and drugged them to the Prophet ﷺ to explain himself. And so I feel like over time, again, this goes back to this idea of performative Islam. I feel like over time, the idea of the Imam is now the embodiment of the perfect Muslim, right? The Imam is the embodiment and the projection of the perfect Muslim, versus the best Muslims were, of course, and we don't like it because we have our bones to pick. I mean, I personally don't, but many of us have our bones to pick with our Salafi brothers and sisters. And of course, one of the tenets of Salafiyah is the veneration of the first generations of Muslims, of which, to be quite honest, that's what all Muslims, had a great veneration for the earliest generations of Muslims. And when you read in those early generations of Muslims, these were people that were very rough around the edges. Yes, they were pious, they were knowledgeable, but they were also real people. And so people to completely lose, oh my God, I can't believe the Imam did this, or the Imam, if you go and read some of the things that transpired between the companions, or just you have projected a false sense of what a Muslim is onto this as a kind of artifice, and then you have demanded its performance by anyone that wants to take up the mantle to be Imam. And of course, this is, in my opinion, there's no coincidence that this attitude has become even more prevalent in the modern age, in the digital age, of which is what? Ones and zeros. Either you are something or you are not something, and there is in a digital world, there is no in between. You're either a 1 or a 0. And I think that we see that even more prevalent today about, Islam in the digital age and the imama in the digital age is that what? You're either a 1 or a 0. We're no longer just the ai and the ulama are not only just the warithun of the anbiya, are not merely just the inheritors. It's as if we are the prophets themselves. Wa na'udhu billah. We are not the prophets. We are not the messengers. May Allah, bless all of them. And so I'm not saying this to defend something that is legal, undoubtedly, but it is also lemam. I found Daniel's, him and his ilk, his followers, being so incensed at the use of certain words and certain terminology, and at the same time, always kind of pining for some imaginary Islamistan, perfect Muslim society, right, down with the West and this and that, and we're going to have this perfect Islamic society. Well, in a real Islamic society, if I used a bad word, then that's something I have to atone to Allah for, and I have to ask Allah to forgive me. But there is no had, right? There are no hudud punishments. There are no punishments to be enacted on a person. Whereas for a person that slanders, and accuses others of lying and gives false testimony, I could have your butt dragged before a judge in order for you to be flogged. And so I kind of wonder if these people that, pine and long for some perfect Muslim society would actually not prefer to live in this one. And I'm not making, and again, I would prefer to live in that society, right? But I really wonder if they would prefer to live in that society versus this one, because the very things that they do would make them subject to its punishments. And so I think we, to maybe end with this is an interesting quote that Sheikh Joe Bradford made from Al-Dhahabi. And he said that, al-jahil, right, the ignorant one, la ya'lamu rutbata nafsihi. He has no idea about his own rank or level. Because he's jahil, he's ignorant, right? That's the meaning of jahil, means an ignorant person. And of course, Daniel, in his interaction with Imam Suhaib, was like, I'm jahil, I'm not a scholar. Okay, so as Dhahabi says, right, la ya'lamu al-jahil, right, how can he say, لا يعلم رتبة نفسه? He doesn't know his own rank. So he says, فَكَيْفَ يَعْرِفُ رُتْبَةَ غَيْرِهِ? So how can he know anything other or somebody else's rank? Right? So how can the ignorant person that has already stated, due to their ignorance, right, that they don't even know themselves, how can they possibly know anyone else? And yet that is precisely what he presumes to know. And I will say this, not because I feel that, I guess I do feel that it needs defending. I'm not saying that Imam Suhaib cannot defend himself. He can, and he's gone and made his own videos and said his own statements about it. But I was a little personally, I was a little bit upset that one of our now senior members of the community, because right, like we're getting it, we're now beyond the stage of young men, and we're starting to make our descent into the senior members of the community, and to drag somebody like that in a tribunal fashion in front of a kangaroo court to have to apologize, to me is really unbecoming. As I had actually told him in a private conversation, if what he did, and we're not saying that it was perhaps not a mistake, as I said, I definitely wouldn't have done an interview with that magazine just because of its history, let alone what they were doing now, but I would have avoided. But okay, but I know his intention. And what I mean by that, I'm not saying that I'm Allah, I know his intention, but I know generally him to be a good person. He has been a scholar and imam for years. And so he made a choice, he made a calculation that now in hindsight, 2020 looking back, it perhaps, or we could even say, should have left it alone. If for nothing else, it would have given your enemies, all the fodder that they needed, right, to go after you. But knowing that he is a good person, I know that he didn't do so to peddle smut, as Daniel says. And so I'll say that this is emblematic of the modern day hypocrite, which is definitely, I'll come right out and say that Daniel exhibits many attributes of the munafiqun. He exhibits many attributes of the hypocrites. And amongst those are false claims to piety. Right? I'm a jahil. Oh, really? Then why don't you shut up? I'm not a scholar. Really? Then why don't you shut up? All these other pretensions. The other one is exaggeration. Exaggeration and constant exaggeration are amongst the attributes of nifaq. That you always have to exaggerate a point, even if there is some kernel of truth in it, you will exaggerate it. So, okay. No doubt that Playboy magazine is a pornographic magazine, has an absolutely despicable history of exploiting and exposing men. No doubt. And then for a apparent short period of time, they arrested the practice of publishing nude photos of women. Does that make everything okay that they did? Obviously not. But that is important to take into consideration of why Imam Suhaib chose to make that calculation. Even if we all agree, that was still an instance of 1 + 1 = 3. Just the math is not right. Should have left it alone. Fine. But he did so in good intentions. But now, to take even what could be deemed as a legitimate misstep, to elevate that now to peddling smut is, and that's just one easy example with Daniel, that every criticism he makes is elevated and exaggerated, or any criticism of him in the attempt for him to deflect it is always a form of exaggeration. And so that's another reason why we need to have a broader conversation in our community about piety and adab and etiquette, not based upon this porcelain doll, very fragile, digital way of looking at it. Either you are salih or you are fasiq, right? Either you are perfect 10 out of 10, a virtual facsimile of a prophet, or you're bereft of any human value whatsoever. And so I really, really, really think that we need to step back and re-examine, what are we really outraged? Have you completely lost all sense of yourself because Mark Manley, Imam Mark Manley, used a couple of words, one that had 3 letters and another that was an abbreviation. Really? And you could not understand that, oh wow, in order for him to come out and say that, he must have really been angry. Or, nah, he's just a fasiq. Or, what kind of imam is this? I mean, I suppose if that is the type of thinking that you are inclined to do, well then this message might as well, kind of like Mission Impossible, I guess it might as well go ahead and self-destruct, because it's probably not going to meet you. But for the rest of you that are at least willing to have a conversation and willing to talk and think, reconsider why those things were said. Yes, when I have great attachment to my friends. I also have great attachment to my profession, and certainly one of the clear also ringers that Daniel is a hyper modernist is that he has absolutely no regard for scholarship. You know, apparently by his own admission, he's jahil. Well, if you're an ignorant person, then you have no regard for scholarship. And that what he does is not only just simply undermine scholarship, and therefore scholars, right? Because again, every imam, other than the ones that are beholden to him and his method of thinking, they're all unreliable. And so now, you know, for young Muslims or uneducated Muslims, right, behind every imam is lurking a predator. Behind every imam is somebody that is a co-opted liberal, this or that. And so you portray the ulama as completely unreliable. But it even goes further than this, in that in doing so, and by collapsing things into this kind of digital binary of black and white, halal, haram, munafiq and non-munafiq, that by collapsing it into this, it's not so much that you want to create a new reality. What you've done is you want to now make reality fantasy. Not so much you want to make fantasy reality, but you want to make, you know, reality a fantasy. And to me, this is extremely dangerous. It needs to be addressed. And so we need more people to get in the game, particularly people in positions of leadership in institutions. I'm tired of having people, every time one of these things happen, when he went after Imam Suhaib, when he went after Imam Omar Suleiman, when he went after Sheikh Joe Bradford, each one of those I made public proclamations and decried Daniel on these. And I keep finding that certain people that work for institutions, whether they're imams or educators, that they remain silent on it publicly. Right, they remain silent, but through the back channels, through the DMs, mashallah, brother, you really stuck it to him. I'm not, again, the performative thing. What do you mean I stuck it to Daniel? I didn't stick anything to Daniel. Yes, I said what I said, but it wasn't sticking it to him. And in fact, if you're such a big fan of sticking it, then why don't you open your mouth as well? And again, I'm really getting impatient with this kind of cowardice that we're finding increasingly amongst our institutions and the people behind and running those institutions. That, again, it's fine for Imam Mark, the silly little convert, you know, who he says he's black, doesn't even look black, but then he talks all hood and ghetto, so to speak, when he gets angry. It's fine for him to be let loose like a little pit bull on Daniel, because that's amusing. Right, that's amusing, but you have increasingly we see the lack of internal fortitude and some bravery on people to come out and call this stuff out. And so I find it actually quite patronizing that if you're going to contact me through back channels and say, yeah, man, you know, you really did it, but you yourself would not say a single harf, a single letter about it publicly, pretty soon me and you are going to have a hard time getting along. So this is all I have to say about this, inshallah. I hope that this will at least give a bit more insight on why I said what I said and why I was so upset about what I said that I said. Meanwhile, as you can see, going back to business as usual, teaching classes on fiqh, teaching classes on iman, and getting back to normative Islamic practice. But again, this idea of particularly as an imam, as a convert imam, as a so-called convert Muslim, even though I hate those terms, I don't care whether it's convert or revert, right, is constantly having to struggle against the kind of like very, very passive-aggressive subjugation of certain parts of the community that want me to perform Islam either for their entertainment or so they can vicariously feel authenticated through their, in their own Islam, instead of really getting about the business of being Muslims for themselves. I really wanted to say something about that, because I feel like this has been an issue going on for quite a while, but nobody really wants to articulate this because they feel, oh man, you're going to kind of ruffle some feathers for doing so. But sometimes you got to ruffle feathers. But جزاكم الله خيرا والصلوات الله تعالى على النبي الأمين وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين والحمد لله رب العالمين. السلام عليكم.